Welcome to Support Life, a program focusing on current social issues from a life-affirming perspective. I'm Gavin Baulch and my guest is Sam Clear. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
You've come a long way from 19 acres over in Tassie.
Yes, I own 19 acres in Tassie. Mum and Dad are from 1,500 acres that I grew up on. I live up in Sydney now, but visiting Melbourne just for a few days with a few engagements.
Okay, so kind of a break from the real city and the perfect countryside.
Yeah, it's a bit difficult to get away from the mountain down in Tassie and go up into, particularly into, I live in the inner west of Sydney. It's about as far away as you can get.
Okay, so we could say this program is brought to you by the letter X and E, X for extreme and E for encounter. What's been extreme in your life?
So, look, even the way that I was brought up, I grew up on Flinders Island out in Bass Strait. Very different childhood to what most people have. I didn't know what key hooks were when I was growing up because we never took the keys out of the ignition of the car. From there, played a lot of sport. Sport was a big part of my life. Represented Tasmania in basketball. Went on to play reserves at the Western Bulldogs in Collingwood. Retired when I was 19 when I broke my back. But from there, ended up on one of the, I guess, biggest journeys possible, being that I headed off around the world on foot. It was actually just walking and praying for unity, but 15,500 kilometres of walking across 21 countries, learning 9 languages as I went, trying to communicate with the people, and 11 near-death encounters. So just trying to stay alive during that. But it was a very long journey, a lot of very big in-your-face lessons to be learnt while I was there, but some wonderful encounters along the way as well.
Okay, all right, so we've covered these 2 alphabetical letters. Let's go back to childhood. And what do you remember?
My childhood was very different to what I see most people's childhoods as now. Mum was working night shift at the hospital and Dad's running the farm. So Dad would be off around the farm, Mum's sleeping during the day. Mum would literally push us outside and say, go and play, don't wake me up. So I didn't want to play with my 3 sisters. I do have a brother, but he's 9 years younger than me. So, you know, as a child, it was just my 3 sisters. I did not want to play the games they wanted to play, Barbie dolls, etc. So I would literally jump on my push bike and head off around the farm by myself. I was always getting in trouble for going on adventures without having told Mum and Dad. So very carefree childhood, really enjoyed it. If I ever have children, I would want to move back to the country.
Yes. Okay, it's the best ecological footprint you could have, isn't it?
Fantastic, but also because when I did actually tee up with Dad and I would head out around the farm, I was not one of these kids who grew up without really knowing Dad. In fact, I probably spent more time with Dad than I did with Mum. Always heading out across the farm and lots of conversations back and forwards. And so at that level, a great relationship still with Mum and Dad. Able to call them up and have a chat at any time. Dad calls all the time just to talk about the weather. That's his way of communicating. It rains, he's happy. It doesn't, he's not so happy. Mum wants to talk about everything else that's going on.
But to live on a farm, you're exercising faith because you can't control the weather.
No, you can't. And this is one of the big lessons that I've learned over probably the last, wasn't really growing up, it was more in the last few years, recognising that we do have faith in everyday things. Faith is a very real part of our life. Mum says she's going to pick you up from school, at the end of school. We have faith in Mum to wait, even if she's 5 minutes late. So yeah, certainly that was there from a very young age, that we weren't in control of everything. There's certain things we can do. Beyond that, we wait, we're patient, and to a point you're at the mercy of, Dad would say you're at the mercy of the elements, Mum would say you're at the mercy of God.
Okay, so someone's word, when given, is precious to be kept. And so how does trust form in that equation?
So certainly during my upbringing, the whole idea of trust being born was simply through relationships and people actually proving that their actions were true to what they were saying. And then in time, as a result, you have faith in the person. Even thinking back to some of my cricket coaches or football coaches, have wonderful faith in those men because they actually pulled through with action for what they were saying. Particularly one of my cricket coaches. He'd never ask us to do something unless he was prepared to do it himself. He'd push us to go really hard with training, but he'd be alongside us doing the 10 hill runs up this enormous hill in Tassie near our school. And then he'd be there actually in the nets training with us while coaching us. And as a result, I think everyone in the team had wonderful faith in him. When he asked us to do something, we knew that he knew where we were at.
Okay, now let's come back to your identity in those days. Was in what?
Predominantly in sport. I saw my identity in success. If I was successful, if I did well, you naturally find some sort of acclaim. Even yesterday, one of my sisters was sending through video clips of her son, my little nephew, who just won his first gold medal at Little Aths. And there's a certain acclaim that goes with having won something. I found a lot of my identity in winning. As a result, I went harder and harder, trained harder and harder. I even remember 1 year training Christmas Day. I was like, well, everyone's going to sleep now in the afternoon, I'll go and do some training. So I took it very seriously. I had a few serious injuries going through high school, but I only used those as motivation to train even harder so that when I came back, I didn't come in at the bottom of the team. You kind of come back in with certain skill sets that are higher than those around you. So my identity was in sport.
Okay, but you weren't competitive unless...
I wasn't competitive unless I was losing. Okay. Yeah, it's a funny thing. I was quite happy to kind of float along and be nice and gentle. And as soon as we started losing, though, no, something kicked, and I would go very hard at that point.
All right. Okay. Now there's a left field kind of kick that comes, and you break your back. Now what changes?
Well, so it wasn't the worst injury. It was a small break, but I broke my back in a tractor accident on Dad's farm. And that was the end of my football career. No spinal damage, but a lot of structural damage. And so at that point, I had to kind of find something else to do with my life in a way. But the funny thing is, there were a lot of things that I was already interested in that I'd never been able to do as a result of having played football full time. My local parish priest found out that I had broken my back, and he said to me, I don't think God wants you to play football. And I laughed at him, and he said, no, I'm serious. He said, I think there are better things in life for you than football.
Sam, that's where we'll take a break of a different kind. You're watching Support Life, and we'll be back after the break. Welcome back to Support Life. I'm Gavin Baulch, and my guest is Sam Clare. Sam, something did become clear to you. You break your back, and this mentor comes along and says, I think now you'll discover some things that maybe God has for you. How did that go? What happened?
Yeah, so initially, I was at university at the time. I was studying mechanical engineering, so I continued with my degree, just put my head down and got stuck into that. But during that time, the engineering faculty, as you can imagine, was a fairly male-dominated one back then, so this is late 90s. We actually drank 32 barrels of beer one afternoon. The lifestyle that went with that was pretty horrendous. I was really being challenged about what I actually believed. I'd grown up with faith, but it had been compartmentalised off to the side. And during that time, really, it just felt as though God was saying, Sam, give me a year. Just give me a bit of your time, basically. So what happened was at the end of my degree, instead of applying for engineering jobs, I thought I'm going to go away and be a missionary for 1 year, use my engineering degree, just give a bit of time, and then come back to Australia and continue on from there. I looked at all the different options available, was in love with the idea of going to Africa. I didn't really know how I'd use my engineering degree, but I was sure that that would come up at some point, I'd be able to use it. In the end, I moved to a place called Borkham Hills in northwest Sydney, a long way from Africa. In the end, what I decided was, if I'm going to do something for 1 year, particularly faith-based, maybe I should do something that's going to stretch me, not something where I feel comfortable. And maybe I should do something where I'm going to feel awkward in front of my mates, just as a challenge for myself, in front of my engineering and footy mates, but also something that's local. instead of going overseas. There's enough to do here in Australia. So we ended up staying here in Australia, ended up doing 5 years with Youth Mission Team Australia, 1 in Sydney, 2 in Adelaide and 2 in Melbourne. And that set me on a very different course. I still haven't, I'm 37 now. I still have not used my engineering degree. I've used it for nothing other than getting mum off my back. She's quite happy that I've got my degree, but it's been a very different journey from there.
Okay, so one degree by another degree, you've moved into this arena of extreme experiences and extreme encounters in this travelling. You did travel, but why? What?
When I was working with Youth Mission Team Australia, I was being invited into meetings as a Catholic representative where lots of different church groups had come together to work on certain missionary projects or ministry ideas. But again and again, those meetings would descend into playground fights. There was one meeting not too far from here in Melbourne, where I was invited into the meeting. I thought they knew I was Catholic. They didn't. They agreed with everything I'd said, which prompted one guy to ask where I went to church, and when I did, there was awkward silence. They stopped dead. And then the guy that had asked the question asked the guy running the meeting why I was there. And he said, I thought this was supposed to be Christians today. Catholics aren't Christian, they don't believe in God. And the guy running the meeting apologised to me and asked me to leave. They wouldn't continue until I'd left. The next meeting I went to, that I was invited to, different group of people working on a different project, the Baptists and the Pentecostals began throwing their Bibles across the table at each other, accusing each other of not being proper Christians, but then asking me to back them up. So this kept going on and on. I met people who lost friends and family because of the church they went to. On the flip side, I met Christians who really didn't want to engage in any sort of dialogue about beliefs that you might consider to be very dangerous. And to be honest, that's well outside the church. That's a bit of a societal thing here in Australia, where if you disagree with something someone believes in, they just kind of eat you alive and start name calling. And we see that across the board. I was just really angry that it was happening within the church on missionary projects. And on one particular day, I knelt down before church, prayed a very simple prayer and said, God, I'd love to help you, but I'm sorry, mate, you're on your own. I'm out. The problem's too big. There's nothing I can do to help. If I try to engage in conversation, it just blows up into argument. It's my opinion versus someone else's. It's not going to make any difference. My background's engineering and football. That's not going to help. In the silence that followed, once I'd eventually shut up, it just felt as though God was saying, Sam, you're right, you can't fix it, but I can. I need you to at least pray for unity. So I began to do that. Unfortunately, that was met with a lot of resistance. People wouldn't even want to pray for unity. This mentality of what the world needs is more people like me. Because if we have more people in the world who think like I think, then we'll have unity, then we'll have peace. Because it's everyone else's fault. Just this, and again, that's not a church problem, that's a societal problem. Of the problem with the world is that we don't have enough people who have my ideology or my way of dealing with issues. It's a throwaway line, not wanting to get involved with the issues at hand. I was even accused by one pastor of a church of not being Christian because I was praying for unity. He considered that to be not a Christian action. So I was becoming really frustrated with what I was seeing. A very broken church in particular. A bit like standing in a car crash and not knowing first aid. And though it was the engineering brain or the male brain kicking in, I wanted to fix it. But the more I thought about it, the more I realised there really wasn't anything I could do to fix this. It was too big. The journey around the world.
The first step.
The big first step. Well, actually, to be honest, the first step was just praying for unity when a lot of people wouldn't. That was the first step. The second step, though, I'd grown up with two heroes in life. One was Gary Ablett, used to play for Geelong. I wanted to be Gary Ablett playing up. My other hero was Francis of Assisi, St. Francis. This was my opportunity to be a little bit more like St. Francis. I was looking at a world map one day and thought, how awesome would it be to do what St. Francis did? Sell everything that I own and just start walking. But whether you want to call it a protest walk or promotional walk for unity, to walk around the world on foot, praying for unity and stopping every single church I passed along the way, regardless of denomination, inviting them at least to pray for each other, to pray for complete unity.
I'm not quite speechless, but I'm interested in outcomes here on this journey. Who was praying for you?
I had a heap of people back here in Australia praying for me, so I was by myself on the journey, but I had a support team back here in Australia. Normally when you consider a journey like this, you have a support crew with you making your hot soup and the rest of it. I was there by myself. My support crew was essentially a prayer-based support crew while I was walking.
Sam, that's a good place to begin to launch the walk. You're watching Support Life. We'll be back after the break. Welcome back to Support Life. I'm Gavin Baulch and my guest is Sam Clear. Sam, there used to be a song when I was younger called These Boots Were Made for Walking. Okay, so you're off on a journey with a foundation of people supporting you in prayer. Wasn't it any prayer walk, was it?
It wasn't, no. Very, very simple mission, pray for unity and invite people to pray for unity, but a very, very difficult mission to execute. I ended up walking 15,500 kilometres on foot. The whole journey was nearly 30,000 kilometres when you take in the airline flights between different places. I was held at gunpoint on 3 occasions, once with a rifle, once with a shotgun, once with a semi-automatic. I was robbed at knife point by 4 men and stripped clean of everything that I owned. Was beaten up on the side of the road a few times, woke up twice in the middle of the night with a man trying to get into bed with me and actually had to fight these guys off in a pitch black room. Very scary thing to wake up to. Didn't sleep well for the rest of the journey. Came face to face with a lot of dangerous animals, a puma, stung by a scorpion on my back, that stopped my heart beating multiple times, struck out by a lot of snakes, was arrested on 3 occasions, was hospitalised many times over. I had salmonella poisoning, typhoid fever, food poisoning on 4 occasions. Walking down a road in Mexico, I trod in a hole and dislodged my hip, had to have that put back in carefully. Tore the cartilage in both knees badly, had to have an operation on my left knee, strained both Achilles tendons, heart arrhythmia, and I had a cut on my left big toe that became very badly infected, staph infection. That was operated on twice, the second time without anaesthetic. So I was gritting my teeth and trying to get through the surgery as quick as I could. Simple mission, really, really difficult journey. And tough to get to the end. I lost 14 kilos by the end. I've put 17 back on. There was not much of me by the time I finished the journey, but was exceptionally grateful for the being able to undertake the mission, and particularly for meeting the people along the way. There's some wonderful people.
Tell me about the people.
So you can imagine I've met every almost conceivable type of person over the course of this journey. Some of the people were very, very dangerous. They were trying to take my life and very happy to get out of those situations. Some of them were just extraordinary in the biggest sense of the word. They were the most loving, hospitable people you're ever going to meet. There was a guy in Panama when no one else in the village would talk to me because I was a white guy. He offered me accommodation in his little hut, a dirt-floored tin shed where he lived with his wife and daughter. They had no running water, no electricity, no modern appliances, no door across that doorway. So to sleep at night, they had to sleep in hammocks slung from the ceiling. He went and found me dinner that night, and the next day I found out that the dinner he'd given me was the only food that he found and his family hadn't eaten. So they went without so that I could have my bread roll with a slice of sausage on it. And he was leaving his wife and daughter the next day to find work elsewhere so that his wife and daughter could eat. And the reason he was having to leave was that no one in that village would talk to him because he was not from that village. He wasn't born there. They all went to the same church. They all went to the same soccer club. They all went to the same grocery store, but they wouldn't talk to him because he wasn't one of them. So meeting people like that who had every right to completely ignore me because of the struggle they were in, and yet I think because of the struggle he was in, he understood how it was not nice for me to have to sleep outside, be homeless for a night and not have food. So he'd invited me in. Wonderful people like this guy.
The graces that come out of suffering.
Yeah, incredible. And also that those who actually embraced the suffering that they were going through ended up being the more loving, the more hospitable, the more joyful people. Those who were running away from their suffering that I met on the walk were the dangerous ones.
Okay. Right. Now, we're using the word encounter here, so we've encountered people of every persuasion, every ilk of the consequence of the fall. Were there any other encounters?
Yeah, and in fact, probably the biggest lesson that I had over the course of the journey was the encounter with God. Now, it's one of those things, I was saying earlier on, it was kind of compartmentalised and pushed off to the side, but I had the opportunity to actually exercise faith. There were times, it wasn't so much about what I'd prayed, I genuinely felt that God was asking me to do something. I do a lot of speaking engagements in high schools, and I often say to the students, it's just like an attack of conscience. It genuinely felt God was asking me to do something, and time again, because my mates weren't there, I wasn't concerned about what they're going to think. I just went with it, just did it, and saw the most incredible fruit. Now, the walk around the world for unity never took off in Australia. The Australian media didn't really touch it. But overseas, again and again, a lot of the time I'd feel that God was asking me to do something. I'd do it, and that would result in massive media coverage of doing this bizarre thing on the side, which felt like a bit of a tangent from what I was doing. But again and again, whatever that tangent was, there'd be a price to pay. It either cost me at a monetary level, or more often than not, it cost me at a letting go of how I thought people would perceive me, or at a physical level. There was a physical toll to pay, often through following those promptings. So it often hurt to trust God. But the beauty and satisfaction born from going through the hard yards, as opposed to doing what everyone else would say was a responsible option in that occasion, ended up being so much more incredible. The fruit born from trusting God, so much more substantial than just taking the bus, so to speak. And in the end, looking back on it, I have to admit that the hardest place to trust God was not while walking around the world. Now that I'm back here in everyday life, I think the hardest place for most people is those really close relationships. Boyfriend, girlfriend, husband and wife, the other half. Siblings with our family. I don't think we mind seeing the homeless through God's eyes, but seeing those closest to us through God's eyes is almost a bit awkward for us. To not look at what I can get out of that relationship, but to look at how can we both lay our lives down for one another, and for that to actually happen at the same time. I think that's the hardest place to trust God.
Sam, this is the hardest thought to leave with our audience, to look into the eyes of the other significant person near you and say, I love you, God loves you.
And to mean it,
yes.
And to live it.
Thank you, Sam.
You're welcome.
You've been watching Support Life. That's all for our program today. Join us again next week. Goodbye.